that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. My name is Callum Dreyer. I've been working the overnight shift at a petrol station on the outskirts of Bruges for about 2.5 years. It's not the kind of job that features prominently in anyone's career ambitions, but the rent in my part of the city is not forgiving, and the night hours genuinely suit me in a way that I've never been able to fully explain to people who are wired differently. Something about the particular stillness of a service station forecourt between midnight and 5 in the morning agrees with me. The flat white light, the quiet intervals between customers, the sense of being the only lit room in a large dark building. I'm 26. I play bass in a band that practices on Tuesday evenings and performs approximately twice a year. I read during the slow hours. It is by any honest measure an uncomplicated life, and I offer this detail because what happened over the past several weeks makes considerably more sense when you understand that I am not a person with a complicated life. This started around 5 weeks ago. It was somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning on a Wednesday. The forecourt had been empty for about 40 minutes, and I was working through a novel behind the till when a car pulled onto the forecourt and stopped at pump 3. I didn't pay it particular attention. Customers at that hour are usually long-distance drivers or night shift workers, people with simple requirements who want to be served quickly and left alone. The car was a dark gray saloon, nothing distinctive. The driver came in a few minutes later. He was a tall man, perhaps 50, wearing a waterproof jacket with the collar turned up despite the fact that the evening wasn't especially cold. He paid for his fuel in cash, which is slightly less common than it used to be, but not unusual enough to register, and added a packaged sandwich and a bottle of water. The notable thing, the one detail I cataloged and then set aside, was the way he stood at the counter. Most people at that hour have the slightly dazed quality of people who have been driving for a long time. This man was entirely alert. He looked at me with a quality of sustained attention that felt more like study than ordinary social engagement. I gave him his change. He left. I went back to my book. A week later, roughly the same time on a Tuesday, the same gray saloon pulled onto the forecourt. Same pump. The man came in and bought the same items. Fuel paid in cash, packaged sandwich, bottle of water. He stood at the counter in the same way. I recognized him. He did not acknowledge recognizing me. He took his change and left without a word. I didn't assign it much significance at that point. Petrol stations attract regular customers the way any routine-based business does, and a person who works nights and drives the same route will naturally stop at the same place at roughly the same time. I filed it under unremarkable and moved on. The third visit, another week later, followed the same pattern so precisely that I began paying closer attention. Same car, same pump, same items, same cash, same deliberate quality of looking at me. This time, I made a point of noting the time, 1:17 in the morning. He left without speaking. I stood at the window and watched the gray saloon pull out of the forecourt and head east on the ring road, and I felt something that I identified with some uncertainty as unease. Not fear, not yet, just the low-frequency signal that something has a pattern to it that you haven't fully mapped. He came back 4 nights later. By this point, I had mentioned the visits to my colleague Yannick, who works the evening shift before me, partly as something to say during the handover, and partly because saying it out loud made it feel less like something I was constructing in my own head. Yannick said it was probably just a truck driver on a regular route, and told me to stop reading crime novels on shift, which was fair advice that I did not take. That 4th visit proceeded identically until the moment he placed his items on the counter. He was looking at me with that same focused, unhurried attention, and as I was putting his change on the counter, he said, with no particular inflection, "You seem to enjoy the quiet shifts, Dreyer." I looked up at him. My name is not on my uniform. There's a small badge on my shirt that says Callum in block letters, but nothing beyond that. My surname is not displayed anywhere in the station. It is not on the receipt. There is no mechanism by which a customer standing on the other side of the service counter at 1 in the morning should know my last name. I stood with his change in my hand and did not speak for what felt like several seconds. Then I asked him how he knew my name. He picked up his items and his change from the counter without answering and walked out of the station. Through the window, I watched him get into the gray saloon and sit there for a long moment before starting the engine and driving away east. I stood behind the till for the remainder of my shift in a state of alert stillness that I found impossible to settle out of. I turned the lights up as high as they go. I stood where I could see the entire forecourt. Every car that pulled in made me straighten. Nothing further happened, but the feeling that had been low frequency for 3 weeks had moved somewhere higher and more insistent, and I drove home that morning paying attention to the cars around me in a way I never had before. There was a note tucked under my windscreen wiper when I reached my apartment building's car park. A plain piece of paper, folded once, with 6 words written on it in a careful, upright hand. You owe a debt. For days, I stood in the car park in the early morning, holding this piece of paper and trying to construct a rational account of it. I have no debts beyond the ordinary kind. I have no history with anyone that would generate language like this directed at me. I am, as I said, a person whose most complicated regular activity is the Tuesday band practice. I stood there long enough for the motion-sensing lights in the car park to switch off, leaving me in the dark with a piece of paper I did not understand. I didn't sleep that day. I lay in my flat with the curtains half open, watching the patch of car park visible from my window, and turned over every person I had ever known and every situation I had ever been part of, and found nothing. Absolutely nothing that corresponded to owing a debt to a man in a gray saloon who stopped at Pump 3. For days passed. Nothing happened. I went back to work and told myself that it was a mistake, a case of misidentification, someone who had confused me with another person or was conducting some elaborate, long-running psychological experiment whose purpose I would never understand. I convinced myself sufficiently to stop checking the car park every time I arrived home. Then he came back. It was a Friday, just after midnight. He pulled onto the forecourt, and this time he did not get out of the car. He stayed at Pump 3 without activating the pump. I watched through the window. After perhaps 2 minutes, he drove up to the kiosk window and opened his car window and looked at me. I opened the service hatch because that is the procedure. He didn't ask for anything. He told me to write something down. I was holding a pen. I'm almost always holding a pen. And he gave me a street address in a district on the southern edge of the city that I only vaguely recognized. Then he told me he wanted 12,000 euros delivered to that address within 3 days. I want to be accurate about what I felt in that moment. It was not primarily fear. It was a kind of vertiginous absurdity, a dissociation between the ordinary fluorescent reality of a petrol station forecourt at midnight and the completely extraordinary content of what I was being told. I looked at the address I'd written on my notepad. I looked at the man in the gray saloon. He looked back at me with the same quality of focused attention he always had, entirely composed, as though he had just placed a sandwich order. Then he drove away. I stood at the service hatch for some time after the taillights disappeared. I went back to the till. I sat down. I picked up my phone twice to call the police and put it down twice without dialing. I spent the rest of the shift trying to decide whether what had just happened was real, and I drove home checking my mirrors all the way. I did not deliver 12,000 euros. I do not have 12,000 euros. I do not have any viable path toward acquiring 12,000 euros within 3 days or 3 decades. I told myself repeatedly that this was a scam of some elaborate variety, and that the correct response was to do nothing, and it would resolve itself the way these things apparently resolve themselves when you refuse to engage. I said this to myself with decreasing conviction over the following 3 days, during which nothing happened, and I almost believed it. On the 4th night, I was home after my shift, sitting on my sofa with a cup of tea and the television on at low volume, when something struck the outside of my living room window hard enough to crack it straight across. I was on the floor before I had consciously decided to move, which tells you something about the state my nervous system had been operating in for the preceding weeks. I stayed down for several seconds. Then I got up and looked at the window and saw the cracks spreading from a central impact point, and, on the floor below it, a stone the size of a fist that had come through the upper pane. By the time I opened the front door, the street was empty in both directions. I called the police. A patrol officer came within 20 minutes, took photographs of the window, and listened carefully to everything I described: the visits to the station, the name, the note, the address, the demand. He wrote it all down. He told me the address will be checked out. He told me to stay inside where possible and to call immediately if there was any further contact. He told me that without camera footage of the person responsible for the window, the available lines of investigation were limited. He was not unkind about any of this. He was simply accurate. The address turned out to be a vacant industrial unit that had been unoccupied for over a year. The patrol that checked it found nothing. That was 8 days ago. I have called in for 3 of the shifts since then, which I cannot sustain financially, but which I also cannot currently think past. The problem, which I am aware of and which I do not have a solution to, is that calling achieves nothing beyond costing me money I don't have, because the man in the gray saloon demonstrably knows where I live. He knew my last name before I had any idea he existed. He has been patient and systematic in a way that suggests he is not going to stop because I missed a few shifts. What I am doing, which feels inadequate, but is the only concrete action available to me, is working with the police to retrieve the forecourt camera footage from each of the nights he visited. Our system retains 30 days of recording and attempting to identify the vehicle registration from the footage. The camera angle is not ideal for plates, but the technical team are apparently able to work with partial reads in some cases. I am also asking whether there is any way to trace the note left on my windscreen, though I understand that handwriting analysis is not the rapid process that television suggests. Why me? I genuinely do not know. I have turned this over more times than I can count. I'm a night shift worker at a petrol station on a ring road outside a medium-sized Belgian city. I practice twice a week in a band that plays to rooms of 40 people. I have no enemies that I am aware of and no history that would generate this kind of sustained, deliberate attention. Whatever the reason, I am still here, and so far nothing worse than the window has happened. And I'm trying to hold on to that as something meaningful while the investigation runs its course. I would say I'm not particularly frightened, but that would be inaccurate. I am sleeping with the hall light on for the first time since I was approximately 7 years old, and every car that slows outside my building gets my full and immediate attention until it drives away. If the gray saloon comes back, I will call the police before I open the service hatch. I should have done that weeks ago. I know that now, with a clarity that is, unfortunately, entirely retrospective. I finished my postgraduate diploma in digital media production about 7 months ago, which has proven to be precisely as lucrative as everyone who tried to talk me out of it predicted. I'm back in my childhood bedroom in my parents' house outside Montpellier, sending applications into a void that occasionally sends back automated rejection emails, and filling the financial gap by delivering for a food courier platform on weekend evenings. It is not what I imagine my mid-20s looking like, and I have made a private agreement with myself not to examine that too closely for the time being. The deliveries run from roughly 8 in the evening until 1 or 2 in the morning on Fridays and Saturdays. The hours when restaurants are busy and people are ordering without much concern for the delivery fee. It keeps petrol in the car and provides the structure of something resembling productivity, which is worth more than it sounds when you are otherwise adrift. This happened about a month ago. It was a Saturday, getting on toward 1:30 in the morning, and I had been considering logging off the app and heading home when a final order came through. The restaurant was on the western edge of the city, which suited me since I'd be heading that direction anyway. The delivery address was the problem, a property well beyond the suburban ring, out where the Garrigues start and the roads narrow and the streetlights stop appearing. I nearly declined it. The distance was substantial, and by the time I'd completed it, I'd be looking at a 40-minute drive back through mostly empty countryside. But the delivery fee was significantly above the usual rate, which is exactly how the platform keeps you from making sensible decisions, and I accepted it. The customer was a woman in her 30s at a farmhouse with a long gravel drive. She came out to meet me, took the bag, thanked me warmly, and went back inside. Entirely routine. It was 2:20 when I turned the car around on the gravel and started back toward Montpellier. I had been driving for perhaps 12 minutes along a two-lane departmental road, flat scrubland on either side, No houses visible, the road stretching straight ahead into genuine darkness when I saw the hazard lights. A car was stopped approximately 50 meters ahead, positioned in the middle of the lane rather than pulled onto the verge. Two figures stood in front of it, facing my direction, and as my headlights reached them, they began making the kind of broad arm movements that mean stop. My first instinct was not to stop. I registered this clearly, noted it, and then overrode it because the alternative was driving past what appeared to be two people stranded in the middle of a dark road in the middle of the night, and I could not construct a version of myself that did that. I slowed and pulled up about 6 or 7 meters from them, leaving the engine running and winding the window down to perhaps a quarter of the way. They were a couple, I thought, somewhere in their 50s. The woman came toward my car while the man stayed near their vehicle. She was wearing a light jacket and carrying a torch, which she pointed downward as she approached. Consider it, in retrospect, since shining in my face would have made me leave immediately. She spoke quickly, with the slightly elevated energy of someone who has been standing on a dark road for an uncertain amount of time and is relieved to finally have an audience. She said there was a bridge out, about 3 kilometers further along the road I was currently on, crossing the creek that ran parallel to the main highway before they diverged. She said it had partially given way sometime in the afternoon, that she and her husband had nearly gone over it themselves, and that she had been warning other drivers ever since. She gestured down the road into the darkness with a kind of emphatic pointing that was presumably meant to indicate where the bridge was, though all it indicated from where I was sitting was more darkness. I asked what I should do instead. The man spoke then, from near their car. He described a turning about 1.5 kilometers back in the direction I'd come from, a forestry track, he said, that cut north through the trees and rejoined the main road to Montpellier before the damaged crossing. It would add perhaps 20 minutes, he said, but it was the only alternative. I thanked them and said I'd find it. I drove away and I did not take the turning. I'm not entirely sure I can explain the reasoning, because at the time it didn't feel like reasoning. It felt more like a physical reluctance, a refusal that came from somewhere below the level of conscious decision. Something about the woman's account had the quality of a speech rather than a report. The specific details were precise in some ways and conspicuously vague in others. The man's description of the forestry track had come a little too readily, like directions that had been prepared. None of this added up to certainty. It was a feeling, and feelings of that kind are easy to dismiss. But I kept driving in the direction I'd been going. The forestry track appeared on my left about 1.5 kilometers back, exactly where the man had said it would be. A dirt road, barely wide enough for a single vehicle, vanishing into dense trees within about 30 meters. I slowed as I passed it and then continued. 3 kilometers further along, I reached the bridge. It was intact, not damaged, not partially collapsed. Fully intact, solid, the kind of modest concrete structure that has been there for 40 years and will be there for 40 more. I drove across it slowly, checking the surface and the side barriers as I went. Everything was exactly as it should be. I was on the main road to Montpellier within a few minutes. I drove home quickly and spent most of what remained of the night not sleeping and thinking about the forestry track and what was on the other side of it. I went back 4 days later. Daytime, the middle of the afternoon, bright September light. I retraced the route with my phone mounted on the dashboard, partly so I'd have the camera running and partly so I could follow the route accurately. The departmental road looked entirely different in daylight, dusty and ordinary, the scrubland on either side pale gold and unremarkable. I passed the point where the couple's car had been stopped, and there was nothing there. I found a forestry track without difficulty. I pulled over and looked at it. There was a sign that had not been there 4 nights earlier. A piece of weatherboard nailed to the trunk of the nearest tree at roughly eye height, with 2 words painted on it in dark letters. VOI Sans Issue. Dead end. The sign was not new. Exactly. The wood had some age to it. The paint was not fresh, but it had not been there at 1:30 on a Saturday morning because I had slowed specifically to look at the entrance to the track as I drove past it, and I would have seen it. Someone had put it up between Saturday night and Tuesday afternoon. I sat in the car and looked at the sign and the track behind it. In the afternoon light, the path was visible for perhaps 80 meters before the tree cover closed over it. It looked narrow and quiet and entirely ordinary. I thought about it for a while, and then I got out. I stood at the entrance to the track and immediately wished I had brought someone with me, which is information that arrived slightly too late to be useful. The feeling that came over me as I stepped out of the car was disproportionate to the situation in a way I couldn't rationalize. It was broad daylight, I was standing on a public road next to my own car, and I was looking at a dirt track and some trees. None of those things are frightening, and yet I stood at the edge of that path and felt something that made the hairs on my forearms stand up, and that made me very specifically not want to take the step that would put me inside the tree line. I stayed where I was, looking down the path, trying to see past the point where it bent slightly to the left and disappeared. I was trying to decide whether I was being ridiculous. I'd almost talked myself into walking in. It was daylight, I had my phone, I could see perfectly well. The worst likely outcome was that I'd slip on a root and feel embarrassed when I heard it. It came from somewhere past the bend in the track, from within the trees, at a distance I could not accurately estimate. A scream, a woman's voice, high and sharp, and then cut off in a way that was worse than if it had continued. Not an animal, though, but that was my first attempt at an alternative explanation. Not a bird call, misidentified at a distance. Not the sound of something mechanical. A human voice in acute distress, lasting perhaps 3 seconds and then gone. I was in my car with the door closed and the engine running before I had consciously decided to move. I accelerated back onto the road and drove, without stopping, until I reached the first inhabited area with other cars and open shop fronts and people walking around in the ordinary afternoon, and then I pulled into a car park and sat there for a while breathing. That was 3.5 weeks ago. I have not gone back. I reported the original incident, the couple, the false bridge claim, the forestry track, to the local gendarmerie about a week after I went back in daylight. The officer I spoke to listened carefully, took notes, asked clarifying questions, and did not tell me I was wasting his time, which I appreciated. He said they would look into it. I have not heard anything since, which I am choosing to interpret as the investigation being ongoing rather than as the report having been filed and forgotten. What I know is this. 2 people on a dark road in the early hours of Sunday morning directed me away from a working bridge and toward a narrow track in isolated woodland. The bridge was intact. Someone put a sign on the track sometime in the following 4 days. When I stood at the entrance to the track on a clear Tuesday afternoon, I heard a woman scream from somewhere inside the trees. I do not know what is on that path. I am aware that not knowing and not investigating are 2 different things, and that I am currently choosing the second. My friend Luke has offered to come out there with me. I am thinking about it. Every time I think about it seriously, I remember the way that sound stopped, and I think about it slightly less seriously than I did before. For now, I drive different routes on weekend nights. The app still sends me long fares to remote addresses, and I still sometimes accept them, because the money hasn't stopped being useful, and neither has the need to feel like I'm doing something. But I drive home the long way now, on lit roads, through places where other people are. This goes back about 3 years, to a period of my life I think of as the gap year that wasn't supposed to be a gap year. I was 28, recently returned to Edinburgh after 4 years working in Copenhagen. And in between more considered employment, I had taken a night security position at a converted industrial printworks on the eastern edge of the city. The building had spent most of the 20th century producing newspaper print runs and had been partially redeveloped into a mixed-use commercial space. Ground floor storage leased to a logistics firm. Upper floors undergoing renovation into office suites that were perpetually 6 months from completion. My shift ran from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, 5 nights a week. I was the sole on-site presence. There was an operations manager named Fenwick I could reach by phone in a genuine emergency. But the understanding was that genuine emergencies were rare, that the job's primary function was simply the fact of a human being present in the building, which apparently deters a category of opportunists that cameras and locks alone do not. I had been doing it for 6 months by the time a night I'm describing happened, And in 6 months, the most dramatic thing that had occurred was a burst pipe on the second floor that flooded the stairwell and required me to stand in 4 inches of cold water at 3 in the morning, waiting for a plumber who arrived at 5. The job had settled into a reliable tedium that I had come to find almost meditative. Clock in, walk the perimeter, settle into the security room with its wall of monitors and its electric kettle. Patrol every 90 minutes. Repeat. The building made sounds, old industrial buildings always do, the frame expanding and contracting, the elevator mechanism clicking through its idle cycles, and I had cataloged all of them. I knew it was normal. That's relevant to what follows. It was a Tuesday in February. The temperature had dropped sharply over the preceding 2 days, and there was a thin layer of ice on the car park that crunched under my boots during the first exterior patrol. The building was secure. I settled in at 20 past 10 with a thermos of tea and began the first camera cycle. The Printworks had 11 cameras covering the interior and 4 covering the exterior approaches. The interior cameras were positioned along the main storage corridor, the loading access at the rear, the stairwells, and the renovation floors above. For the first 3 hours, nothing of any note occurred. I did my half 11 and 1 o'clock patrols without finding anything irregular. The ice in the car park had hardened further. The street beyond the perimeter fence was empty. At 20 minutes past 2, Camera 7 triggered a motion alert. Camera 7 covered the rear section of the ground floor storage corridor, a long straight aisle running between metal pallet racking that stretched to the ceiling on both sides, storing the logistics firm's overflow inventory. Box components, wrapped pallets of flat-pack shelving, sealed crates of unspecified industrial equipment. The alert was not in itself alarming. The system was calibrated sensitively and triggered regularly on nothing. A shift in air pressure from the ventilation cycling, the settlement of a stack that had been imperfectly balanced. I pulled up the feed and watched for 90 seconds. The corridor was empty. The racking on both sides stood undisturbed. I cleared the alert and returned to my tea. 7 minutes later, Camera 7 triggered again. I pulled up the feed. Empty corridor. Same as before. I watched for 2 minutes. Nothing moved. I cleared it. Over the following hour, Camera 7 triggered 11 times. Each time I checked the feed and found the corridor empty. What I noticed progressively was that the movement the sensor was registering appeared to originate consistently at the far left edge of the frame. The blind corner where the corridor met the fire exit alcove, a section the camera could not fully cover. The camera was positioned to give a clear view of the aisle, not the alcove. Whatever was triggering the sensor was doing so from a position that remained consistently outside the camera's angle. I noted this in a log with the precise phrasing available to me at the time, which was, repeated motion alerts Cam 7, no visual confirmation, movement possibly alcove origin. No other cameras triggered all evening. Only Camera 7, only from that edge of the frame, with a regularity that moved somewhere between 11 times over an hour from unremarkable to something I did not yet want to name. At 2:30, I put my jacket on and went in. The ground floor storage area was accessed through a fire door off the main corridor. The overhead strip lighting operated on a reduced circuit overnight, giving the space what I can only describe as an institutional twilight. Enough light to navigate, not enough to see the far end of the aisle without a torch. The racking units on either side rose 3.5 meters to the ceiling, creating the particular oppressive quality of any high-shelf space at night, the sense of walls that are higher than they should be and that lean slightly inward. I walked the full length of the main aisle slowly, torch supplementing the overhead strips, checking each cross aisle as I passed. Everything was in order. The pallet stacks were undisturbed. The wrapped loads were intact. At the far end of the corridor, I checked the fire exit alcove, the section outside Camera 7's frame, and found nothing. The fire door was sealed and alarmed. The floor of the alcove was concrete, dusty enough to show disturbance, and there was no disturbance I could identify. I stood in the alcove for a moment, torch off, letting my eyes adjust fully to the low light. The building was silent in the specific way of large interior spaces at night, which is not the same as quiet. It's a silence with texture to it, the ambient sound of a building existing and doing so slightly audibly. I had been in this silence many times. I knew what it sounded like. And then, from 2 aisles to my right, I heard something being moved. Not the creak of racking or the pop of temperature changes in the roof structure. A deliberate sound. Something with mass being shifted across a concrete floor, a sustained scraping that lasted perhaps 4 seconds and then stopped. The sound of something being repositioned intentionally. I stood completely still and listened. The silence that followed was absolute. I waited for the sound to repeat, and it did not. I crossed to the adjacent aisle with my torch off, walking as quietly as I could on the concrete, and swept the beam along the length of it. Empty. I checked the aisle beyond that. Empty. I went back to the security room and cycled through all 11 interior cameras, and every feed showed undisturbed space. I sat at the desk and wrote in the log. Unusual sound from storage area, scraping, approximate 3:35, no visual confirmation on cameras, source unidentified. I called Fenwick. He answered on the 4th ring with the voice of a man who had been asleep. I told him what had happened. He told me to make sure the exterior was secure and to log it. He did not suggest coming in. I did not hear anything further for 40 minutes. I had more or less succeeded in attributing the sound to some internal structural cause, a pallet stack settling under its own weight, the kind of delayed mechanical event that old buildings perform without warning. When, at 20 past 4, it happened again. This time it was louder, and it was followed immediately by a heavy impact, the sound of something rigid striking something else rigid, carrying the particular resonance of a large interior space. I cycled through the cameras immediately. Feeds 1 through 8 showed nothing. Feed 9, covering the far end of the upper storage area, was showing static. The static lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then the feed returned. The image was the same space, the same angle, except it wasn't quite the same angle. The camera was covering a section of floor that was shifted perhaps 3 degrees to the left of where it had been positioned. Not dramatically, not enough that someone unfamiliar with the layout would have noticed. But I've been watching these feeds for 6 months, and I knew every frame by its content, and what I was looking at was not what camera 9 showed from its installed position. The camera had been moved. Something in that space had made contact with it and shifted it. I put on my jacket and took the radio and went back in. The upper storage area was accessed by the goods lift, a large open platform elevator that served all 3 floors. I took the stairs instead. The second floor was mid-renovation, bare concrete, unpainted plasterboard walls that had been installed but not finished, the skeleton of what would eventually be office partitions creating a maze of incomplete rooms. Camera 9 was positioned at the far end of the main corridor, mounted on a bracket screwed into a plasterboard partition. I found the camera with its bracket partially rotated on the mount. Not broken, not disturbed violently. Turned, as if someone had reached up and physically adjusted its angle by hand. I stood in the unfinished corridor of the second floor of a building I was certain was sealed, looking at a camera that had been manually turned, and I was aware that I had been doing this job for 6 months without being frightened by it once, and that I was frightened by it now. I did the rest of the upper floor sweep with a methodical care that was partly professional instinct and partly a way of keeping my mind occupied enough not to follow the available line of reasoning to its conclusion. Every room, every space large enough to conceal a person. I found no one. The stairwell was empty. The renovation materials stacked along the east wall were undisturbed. The single window with a broken latch that Fenwick had been meaning to report for 2 months was exactly as it had always been, closed but not secured. I went back to the security room and sat there until 6. Fenwick arrived at 6:15. I showed him the log, the camera alerts, the reposition bracket. He brought in the maintenance contractor at 9 that morning, and they spent 3 hours going through the building. They found nothing. No evidence of entry at any point on the perimeter. Not the broken latched window, not the loading doors, not the fire exits. No evidence that anyone had been in the space. The camera bracket was examined and deemed to have been improperly installed, capable of shifting under certain vibration conditions. The scraping sounds were logged as probable structural settlement. Investigation inconclusive. I understood that these explanations existed on paper and did not account for the specific sequence of events I had experienced. I also understood that nobody was going to tell me they believed something had been in that building because their professional obligation was to the explanations that required the least uncomfortable conclusion. I did not argue with this. I wrote my own account of the night in the log with as much specificity as I could manage and left it there. I worked the site for another 4 months before a restructuring eliminated the overnight security requirement entirely. In those 4 months, Camera 7 triggered its usual quota of wind-related alerts, and Camera 9 sat on its bracket at its slightly adjusted angle, and nothing resembling that night ever happened again. I told myself this was reassuring. I still don't know what was in that building. The maintenance team's inspection had been thorough enough to rule out most of the obvious explanations, and what remained when you ruled those out was a set of events I had no framework for. Footsteps that stopped when mine did. A camera repositioned by hand in a secured space. A pattern of alerts that consistently originated from outside the camera's field of view, as if whatever was triggering them was aware of where the camera could and could not see. That last thought is the one I try not to settle on for too long, because it leads somewhere I don't find it useful to go. Most nights in that job were entirely unremarkable. But that Tuesday in February is the most purely frightened I have ever been in a professional context. And the frightening part was never what I found. It was the sustained, accumulating certainty, building from 1 in the morning through to 6, that something was there, and that it was considerably more aware of me than I was of it. I want to be clear that I have never spoken about this in full to anyone outside of the responding officers and 2 members of my immediate family. Writing it down now, several years later, is something I have considered and postponed more times than I can count. I'm doing it now because I think the distance has finally gotten long enough that I can get through it without stopping. At the time, I was 19 and working the overnight shift at an indoor aquatic center in a mid-sized town in the north of Portugal, about 30 kilometers from Porto. The facility was privately operated, open around the clock to members, and accessed via electronic membership card at a reader beside the main entrance. The building contained an Olympic-length lap pool, a smaller recreational pool, a sauna suite, and the usual changing rooms and reception area. Between midnight and 6 in the morning, the center ran with a skeleton staff. On most nights, this meant myself, and depending on the schedule, occasionally one other person. On the night I'm describing, I was alone. My responsibilities were straightforward. Monitor the entrance log and the camera feed from the reception office. Do periodic walkthroughs to check the pool deck and changing rooms. Keep the facility clean during the quiet hours and manage any member concerns. The job had a quality of peaceful solitude that I had come to value. Most nights passed without incident. Members who came in at that hour were serious swimmers, competitive athletes, insomniacs with structured routines, and they required nothing beyond a working pool and the quiet to use it. I had been in the position for 4 months by the time this happened. I knew the regulars, I knew the building's rhythms, and I had developed the particular comfort of someone who has worked a solitary overnight shift long enough to stop finding the darkness and quiet unsettling. That comfort did not survive what happened on this particular night. It was somewhere around 1:30 in the morning. I had completed my midnight and 2 o'clock walkthroughs, finished logging the equipment maintenance checks, and settled back into the reception office to watch the camera feeds. The building was quiet. 2 members had come in earlier in the evening and left by 1, and as far as I could tell, the facility was empty. I was working through the camera cycle when I noticed activity in lane 8 of the lap pool. Someone was swimming. This in itself was not alarming. Members could enter during overnight hours without announcing themselves, and the entrance log was supposed to capture all card swipes at the door. What caught my attention was the pace. I pulled up the lane 8 camera feed and watched. The swimmer was moving through the water at a speed that was significantly above recreational. Not unusual for a competitive athlete, but I had not seen anyone enter since before midnight, and the entrance log on my screen showed no card swipe since 11:47, a woman I recognized as a master swimmer who had left by 1:15. I checked the entrance log twice. No record of an entry after that point. I pulled the pool camera feed onto the main monitor and watched more carefully. The swimmer was doing continuous freestyle lengths, turning at each wall with a flip turn that barely interrupted the pace. I watched 5 lengths, then 8, then 12. The swimmer did not slow, did not pause at the wall, did not stop to adjust goggles or rest on the lane rope. Just continuous, mechanically consistent lengths at a pace that would have been creditable at a regional competition. 14 minutes passed. The swimmer did not stop. I zoomed the camera feed. The image resolution at that hour, in the overhead lighting of a pool running at reduced power, was not ideal. What I could see was a figure in the water in dark clothing, not a swimsuit, or not what appeared to be a competitive swimsuit. The swimmer's head came out of the water during the breathing rotation and freestyle, and in those moments I could see that the hair was long and loose, spreading across the surface with each stroke. 19 minutes. The swimmer did not stop. I sat in the reception office looking at the camera feed and experiencing a feeling that I can only describe as the sensation of something being wrong without being able to specify what exactly. The swimmer was in the pool. The pool was not locked or inaccessible at this hour. The fact that the entrance log showed no card swipe was irregular, but not impossible. The reader had malfunctioned before. There was an explanation for everything I was seeing, and yet, I wrote in the log, unregistered presence in lap pool, approximate 2:31, activity ongoing, investigating. Then I went out. The pool deck connected to the main corridor via a set of double fire doors that I propped open as I passed through. The overhead lights in the lap pool area were running at the reduced overnight level, casting the water in that particular blue-white quality that indoor pools have at night. Luminous from below, the lane ropes throwing parallel shadows across the tiles. The smell of chlorine was, as always, immediate and complete. I came through the fire doors and stopped. The swimmer was in lane 8. I could see them clearly now from the pool deck, a figure in what appeared to be ordinary clothing, dark trousers and a long-sleeve top, hair spreading across the surface with each stroke cycle. Swimming in clothing was against facility policy, as was swimming without registering at reception. These were the things I was supposed to address. I stood at the edge of the deck and looked at the feet. The swimmer was not wearing fins. Competitive swimmers sometimes use training fins for certain sets. This person was not wearing fins. What I was looking at was bare feet, and as the kick cycle brought them partially above the surface with each stroke, I could see that the feet were not moving correctly. The flutter kick in freestyle has a particular rhythm and range. Trained swimmers develop it efficiently. Recreational swimmers do it with effort. What I was seeing was something else. The feet were moving with a quality that I cannot describe well in retrospect. They moved too much. The range of motion in the ankles was wrong, and the water around the feet in the backwash of the kick had a color to it that the pool water should not have had. It took me several seconds to process what I was looking at. The water trailing behind the swimmer's feet was darkening the water around it. Not dramatically, not in the way of a wound that has been untreated for a long time, but a thin, persistent discoloration that the pool's filtration system had not yet had time to dilute. The swimmer's feet were bleeding into the water with every kick, and the bleeding had been going on long enough to be visible in the wake. The swimmer's face turned to breathe. I saw it clearly in profile for the first time. The expression was nothing. Not concentration, not pain, not the slightly pinched focus of exertion. Simply nothing. Eyes open, face neutral, mouth closing over the waterline in the rotation and opening again as the head turned back. A face that was present and entirely absent simultaneously. I called out from the pool deck. I said something standard. I honestly cannot reconstruct the exact words. Something about needing to stop and come to the deck. My voice was louder than I intended it to be. The acoustic quality of an indoor pool at night amplifies everything. The swimmer did not stop, did not alter pace, did not turn toward me. I called out again, more specifically, something about the requirement to stop swimming. The swimmer completed another length, executed the flip turn at the far wall, and came back. As they passed me in the water, heading toward the far end of the pool, they said something. Not loudly, not with any evident effort. A voice that came from somewhere between the breath and the stroke, without the rhythm being broken. Is anybody watching? That was what it sounded like. for words delivered in a voice of such complete flatness that I took a step backward on the pool deck without deciding to. I said yes. I told them I was there. I was the overnight staff. They needed to stop swimming and come to the deck. They reached the far wall, turned, came back. Is anybody watching? Same words, same flatness. Not a question being asked of me, not directed at me in any meaningful sense. Said in the way that certain people in severe psychological states repeat phrases that have become disconnected from their original meaning, a loop of language running without the person driving it. I stood on the pool deck for a moment and understood that what I was looking at was a medical situation and a safety situation simultaneously, and that I was not equipped to handle either without help. I walked back through the fire doors toward the reception office. As I pushed through the double doors, I glanced at the small window set into the door panel that gave a line of sight back to the pool deck. The swimmer had stopped, not at the wall, not at a natural pause in the set. Stopped in the middle of lane 8, treading water, facing the fire doors. Facing me. I went to the office, sat down, and pulled up every camera feed simultaneously. On the pool camera, I could see the figure still in the water, now completely motionless, facing the fire door direction. On the corridor camera, I could see the fire doors from the other side. Nothing had come through them. I reached for my phone to call for emergency services. Before I dialed, I looked at the corridor camera again. The figure was in the corridor, not in the pool. In the corridor outside the fire doors, approximately 8 meters from the reception office, facing the camera directly. Standing still, mouth open, head slightly tilted, dark clothing soaked through and dripping onto the tile floor, leaving a spreading, wet outline at their feet. I looked at the pool camera. The pool was empty. Lane 8, undisturbed water, settling back to stillness. The faint pink-tinged discoloration near the far wall, the only evidence that anyone had been there. I do not know how they crossed from the pool to the corridor in the time it took me to look at 2 camera feeds in sequence. I do not know how they passed through the fire doors without triggering the sound of them. I do not know how they were standing in a dry floor corridor 8 meters from the office while still soaking wet, with their mouth open and their eyes on the camera, in the time that I looked away and looked back. I locked the office door. My hands were shaking enough that I missed the lock twice before it engaged. 5 seconds after I locked it, the handle moved. I called emergency services and did not take my eyes off the camera feed showing the corridor. The figure was still there, still motionless, still facing the camera, while the handle of the office door moved and then was still and then moved again. I gave the dispatcher the address and explained that there was an intruder in the facility who was injured and behaving in a manner that I could not account for. I told them I had locked myself in the office. The dispatcher told me units were on their way and to stay on the line. The figure in the corridor opened its mouth wider. What came out was not a word. It was a sound that I lacked the vocabulary to describe accurately. Not a scream in the way that the word scream suggests, not a human voice in the register of a person in pain or anger. A sustained, low, chest-deep sound that carried through the office door and through the walls as if the walls were not there. It lasted for what I timed afterward from the call log as approximately 4 minutes. For minutes during which I sat in the corner of the office with the phone pressed to my ear and the dispatcher's voice in it and the sound coming through every surface of the room around me. And I was absolutely certain, with a certainty that I have not experienced before or since, that if the lock did not hold, I was going to die in that room. Then it stopped. The handle did not move again. The corridor camera showed an empty corridor with a wet trail on the tiles that ended approximately 3 meters from the office door in nothing. The police arrived 11 minutes later. 2 officers. They searched the full facility before they would allow me to leave the office, and they found no one. The entrance log showed no exit. The pool area showed the water disturbance and the discoloration near the far wall. The corridor showed the wet trail. The changing rooms showed nothing. The external door log showed no exit event. They found no one. I resigned the following morning by telephone. I have not been inside an indoor swimming pool since, which has proven more limiting than I anticipated, but which I have not yet been willing to revise. I don't know what that person's intentions were. I don't know what condition they were in, or how they entered or left a card access only building without triggering a single log entry in either direction. I think about the question they kept asking while they were swimming, and whether it was intended for me or for something else, or whether it was intended for no one at all, just language running without anyone behind it. What I think about most when I let myself think about it is that moment on the pool deck when I saw the face in profile. The complete absence of any legible expression. I have tried many times to find a way to describe what that looked like, and the closest I can get is this. It looked like a face that had forgotten there was a reason to have expressions and had stopped bothering. That image has not left me. I don't expect it will.